Hello everyone. Thank you so much for investing your time with us. My name is Maurice Matta and it's an absolute pleasure to be here today. Welcome to all of you here in the studio and virtually joining us online. Following the 1975-1990 civil war, successive governments racked up debt with little to show for it, resulting in a grave economic catastrophe in Lebanon. The scale of Lebanon's economy collapse is difficult to overstate, with the World Bank describing it as the worst recession in over 150 years. Since 2019, poverty has dramatically increased, with the local currency plummeting to a fraction of its pre-crisis value. The result has been severe inflation and unemployment, putting the cost of basic living out of reach for thousands of people, and resulting in severe and humanitarian need. State bankruptcy has led to a breakdown in public services. The service-oriented economy's backbone, banks, is paralyzed. Well, today we will have an amazing panel. The Meishidia Foundation Media Institute is conducting this panel entitled The Pressing Economy Situation in Lebanon, Challenges and Solutions, under the project Renewing Lebanon Political and Economic Structures, in partnership with the Public Affairs section in the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. Well, this panel is conducted in English and it will be broadcasted on MCF YouTube channel, Facebook page. At the end of this panel, I'll be asking our panelists to give us some recommendations to be inserted in the MCF project final report. First, I'll take a few moments to briefly introduce our panelists. We have His Excellency Dr. Kamil Bouslayman, Capital Market Specialist, former Minister of Labor in Lebanon. He's joining us via Zoom. Also, we have His Excellency Mr. Pierre Ducan, Ambassador in charge of coordinating international support to Lebanon. Also, he's joining us via Zoom. His Excellency Ghassan Hasbani, former Deputy Prime Minister, former Minister of Health in Lebanon. Also, we have His Excellency Dr. Nasser Saidi, an economist, former Minister of Economy and Trade in Lebanon, who's joining us also via Zoom, and Mr. Saad Sabra, Country Head, Senior Country Officer, IFC. Welcome. So I'll start by giving each panelist a few minutes for a quick presentation or a quick brief, a keynote related to our main topic, the pressing economy situation in Lebanon, the challenges and solutions. We want to know your overall opinion on this topic, and we will start here. Well, let me start directly with Mr. Nasser Saidi. So each one of our panelists will have 3 to 4 minutes so for the presentation, for the keynote, and then I'll go and proceed directly with the questions. Dr. Nasser Saidi, you can start.
Thank you, and thank you for organizing this panel session. You mentioned that Lebanon is facing grave problems. In fact, what's happening in Lebanon is of historic proportions. The decline of GDP since 2018 is about 58% in real terms. That surpasses the biggest crisis previously known, which was in Chile in 1926. So a massive decline in real GDP. Poverty is now reaching, multidimensional poverty is now reaching 80% of the population. Unemployment is running at 50%. There is massive migration and therefore loss of our human capital. The Lebanese pound has depreciated by more than 85%. Inflation currently, by January latest estimates, running at an annual rate of 240%. Food inflation running close to 480%. So the impact in terms of poverty and the impact in terms of population is just staggering. Just so that people can understand a little bit what we're talking about. The minimum wage right now in Lebanon, current exchange rates, is now running at $28 per month. A university professor is earning about $156 per month. A soldier at $54 per month. And a judge at around $187 per month. So you can imagine the impact this has on people's day-to-day lives. But more serious than that is the destruction of wealth. The inflation and exchange rate depreciation, what people euphemistically call lirification and haircuts, has meant effectively that the financial wealth and also other forms of wealth of Lebanon have declined by some 85%. And that is the wealth of several generations. It's not just one generation. It's several generations who brought their money into Lebanon. What is damning about the situation is that it is man-made. It's not the result of a natural disaster. It's not the result of a catastrophe. It is man-made. It is a deliberate policy of actually avoiding reform. Back at the time of the Diab government, a proposal had been made with the assistance of Lazare Frère that would have provided, in principle, a holistic approach to Lebanon's problems. And you need a holistic approach because the problem is fiscal. There have been large fiscal deficits resulting in a large accumulation of debt running at over 175% of GDP. There were large current account deficits, i.e. over-consuming, and this was allowed through the pegging of the exchange rate, a long-term policy pursued by the central bank, which allowed you to consume much more than your ability. And you had two unsustainable deficits, a current account deficit and a fiscal deficit. And those effectively exploded starting in 2020. And the trigger to that explosion was the closure of the banks in October and November 2019. This was unprecedented and created a loss of confidence in the banking system and therefore a run on the banks that then led to a cessation of payments, a blocking of deposits, both in Lebanese pounds later on, as well as in dollars. The result is really an economic and financial crisis, but also underlying that, a deep political and governance crisis. And now, of course, we're living an education and health crisis. And of course, public services have been severely affected. Electricity, water, most people don't get 2 hours of electricity per day. So I mentioned that this was man-made, and the implication of that from a political level is that there has to be accountability for what happened. And that accountability also needs to extend to other events which happened, such as the explosion in the port of Beirut, which today, until today, nobody has been held accountable, either politically or economically. So as we move forward, we need to think holistically. In other words, we need to think of resolving the economic, banking, financial, and economic crises as the core, and the banking system lies at the core of that. So moving forward, what is going to be required is multidimensional, but importantly, at the core, we're going to have to look at the banking and financial sector and restructure that banking and financial sector, including the central bank, restructuring public debt, because government is no longer able to service the debt. And you have three interlinked balance sheets resulting from the crisis: the government's balance sheet, the banks and the BDL's balance sheet. Those three fit together, are interlinked, and you cannot solve one without the other. So any solution has got to address the government and the fiscal sector and fiscal reform. It has to address the restructuring of the central bank, the BDL, starting with a forensic audit, and it has to lead to a restructuring of the banking system. Those have got to be at the core. You will not be able to move forward in terms of rebuilding the economy and getting trust back if you don't address the core of the issue, which is the banking sector. And let me be very clear, what we're living is the bursting of a Ponzi scheme. Responsibility of the central bank that borrowed increasingly simply to protect an overvalued Lebanese pound. And that led to an increase in debt and increased the burden on government due to higher and higher interest rates over time. So it increased fiscal deficits. And at the same time, the overvalued exchange rate meant that you were running larger and larger current account deficits. So moving forward, that has to be our priority. Of course, underlying all this is the fact that you have massive corruption, endemic corruption. And of course, that is the primary responsibility for the large deficits. It would have been fine if we had borrowed to build assets, but we did not borrow to build assets. We borrowed to finance current consumption. So let me stop there and just to say that there's a historic responsibility on all of us.
We will elaborate more.
To try to rescue that.
We will elaborate more, Dr. Saidi, during the Q&A we will have in a couple of minutes. Mr. Pierre, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much, and many thanks to the Meshidiak Foundation for organizing such a gathering with such distinguished speakers. On the one hand, I would tend to say that our topic is absolutely relevant those days, and because, as just said by Minister Saidi, the country is in a deep recession, and on the other hand, I would tend to imagine that we all know the challenges and the solutions, and that the keywords are, if I may say, just political will and implementation. And when I mean political will, I mean from all stakeholders, not only from the classical political elite, but from everybody, from the economic elite, from the think tankers, from the new forces, for the whole population. And there is still a kind of denial in all circles on the nature of the crisis. And let me take two extremes. Some would argue on the one hand that the crisis is purely financial. And even some would say it's a pure liquidity crisis when at the minimum it is a solvability crisis. And these people would easily imagine that the passing of time and the classical resilience, strong resilience of the Lebanese people would be sufficient. Another group, the other extreme, others would think that it's purely a governance crisis and that a massive change in the leadership and a permanent fight against corruption would be the solution. And you would easily put names under these two extreme positions. I think these two groups share, if I may use John Maynard Keynes' terms, the same monetary illusion. They all think in nominal terms, not in real terms. And they think that a burden sharing, different, of course, in the two cases, of the losses of the financial sector in the wide meaning, would be the solution of the crisis. Of course not. What is at stake is not a nominal resolution of the crisis, but a real treatment of this crisis, which is holistic, as just said, multidimensional, and should lead to a complete redefinition of the economic and social Lebanese model, which, it was eloquently said, was based on a false prosperity, bought by an overvalued exchange rate and a growing debt. And I note that even today, many Lebanese, I do repeat, in all circles, do not acknowledge the gravity of the crisis or think that external developments will change the face of Lebanon. And in that context, that was not addressed right now, the consequences of the war in Ukraine are not representing a change in nature of the crisis, but just a change in the degree in the gravity of it. And it is, to some extent, fascinating to see that the Ukrainian crisis has just reinforced, not created, the structural weaknesses of the Lebanese economic model, financial disorder, and volatility of the currency, high dependency to imports in general, excessive role of the imported fossil fuels for production of energy, probably low level of wheat stocks, especially after the blast in the port, in the context also of non-diversified, geographically non-diversified imports from Russia and Ukraine, the absence of visibility in the economic policy. So all of that is in front of our eyes and was just put to light. So it was not a trigger, the Ukraine crisis, not a revealer of the Lebanese crisis, but I hope that this crisis in Ukraine, including, of course, the refugees aspect, the humanitarian aspect, will not be a competitor in the mindset of international community, competitor to the Lebanese crisis. For what concerns my country, France, it would continue to have Lebanon in mind. Even now, President Macron has said 18 months ago in French, forgive me, je ne vous lâcherai pas, but the ambiguity exists only in French, which means I will not abandon Lebanon, but it means also I will continue to push you to act and reforms. And it is still in the same mindset today in March 22, even having in mind, of course, other big challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ducan. Your Excellency, Mr. Ghassan Hasbani.
I won't add much to what was said already, but basically we all know the diagnosis, how far the crisis has gone, how deep it has gone. Unfortunately, if we continue with the way things are going, it is set to be even deeper and even more complex in the future. So there seems to be no end to how bad the situation can go. We could reach to a point where really we have no foreign reserves anymore, completely cut off from the rest of the world, very difficult to be as a part of any transaction internationally. This has not just been the crisis that was brewing for the last 10 years or probably 30 years, as some may describe it. It's been quite intense even in the last 2 years, because no brakes have been pulled on the crisis, no action to be even noted that has actually been taken in the last 2 to 3 years. So this has exacerbated the situation further. We haven't even started looking at how we deal with the default that happened a couple of years ago. There's no sign of how a recovery plan can be put together. Lots of talks, lots of ideas, the previous government, the current government, an IMF program that's still far from being achievable, given that this is an outgoing government, there are elections, etc. So without going into the description of the crisis, which has already been covered and may be covered further, let's look at the diagnosis of the causes and the situation, how it arose. Today, it's a question of political mix, political will, seriousness in managing a country and addressing issues of a country that led to the economic collapse. All the deficits we're talking about, whether it's a fiscal deficit, whether it's a trade deficit, whether it's an economic stagnation and collapse, all of these are all interrelated, going back to a political situation that has led to complete chaos in managing a country. It is definitely a governance issue. It's definitely a corruption issue, but also it's a global isolation issue of Lebanon that the Lebanese political system has not been used to in the past, because the international community has always turned a blind eye and tried to, create a common denominator of acceptance of the situation and kept moving forward with the situation that was building up for the last 30 years, and particularly in the last 20 years, and more so in the last 10 years, until the international community woke up to this situation and the fact that this can no longer continue. that we started realizing the dryness of capabilities and resources. So what we're looking at now is practically a failed state scenario. And we're looking at a state that's controlled politically by particular groups that have power over the decision, that they have the power to derail any decisions in government. So if we keep blinding ourselves to the fact that there is no state today that is sovereign and independent and acting properly, and keep blinding ourselves to the fact that some parts of the international community still consider this to be actually the official counterpart on the other side, we'll still have to deal with the same problem. Today, Lebanon needs a rescue that requires international involvement, and it does require international patronage. Otherwise, we keep hearing that the solution has to come from within, and every now and then somebody drops out of the system, leaving the others to try to solve it, and we're not reaching there because the solution was created from within, and we cannot expect the same groups that created and caused that solution to move forward and try to solve it. The problem that exists today is serving certain political agendas. We have to look at that honestly and state the elephant in the room. It is part of a regional and global situation that cannot be disconnected totally from it. What we need in Lebanon right now is a political rescue plan, which will eventually lead to the economic rescue plan. Otherwise, we've been having these conversations for the last, even before the collapse, for the last 5 years, and even before that, leading to no proper conclusions, because there were powers and forces that are beyond those who are planning or putting solutions on the table, or even beyond the goodwill of the international community, that have been derailing every single attempt to solve the problem, dismissing every single thought about moving forward. So, corruption, lack of will to reform and restructure, and a political situation that is fueling all the above. This is what we need to address, the elephant in the room.
Thank you. Your Excellency, Dr. Kamil Boustaimin, do you agree that Lebanon needs today a political rescue plan? And Lebanon is considered today as a failed state, so I'm just asking a general question, so you can start from here, maybe your presentation or your speech.
Thank you, Maurice. We're not quite a failed state, but we're getting quickly there. I want to try to focus a bit more on the positive. I don't want to really get into the causes of why we got here. I think we know them. I think there is actually a deliberate attempt, as the World Bank said, actually, not to address the causes and, in fact, to deepen the crisis. I think there are a few things that are important to note. Number one, I think there is no understanding in Lebanon of the importance of the passage of time. Had we started with a solution 2.5 years ago when the crisis started, we probably would be now out of the crisis. Ukraine took less than 2.5 years to get out of their crisis. Greece took about 3 years. So we wasted 2.5 years. We were in a much better position at the beginning of the crisis with the reserves much higher. We probably wasted $20 billion of reserves without any accountability or transparency. So time is incredibly powerful, and politicians in Lebanon don't understand the value of wasting time. This is the first comment. The second one, clearly accountability is critical, and I for one think that anybody who transferred any money after October 19, obviously subject to the exceptions, medical emergency, etc., students abroad, but any politician or bank insider or shareholder who transferred money committed a crime, in my view, and should bring the money back. So I think accountability is important, and you need, for any solution, you need to have credible people because the solutions will be difficult. Of course, not as difficult as what we have already gone through with 90% inflation and depreciation, but there will be sacrifices, and you need people who are credible to try to discuss those with the population. However, we confuse accountability and solution. when the IMF gets to a country, they don't start by asking who was responsible for getting the crisis. They deal with the solution. In Lebanon, we confuse both. We need to have both, but we cannot wait to have the accountability completely done before we envisage the solution. I think we need to do three things immediately. Number one, try to get to an agreement with the IMF before, even before the elections, before May. I don't think it's impossible. I think it's possible. Of course, it won't be implemented because the prior actions would need the new parliament. But we need to go to the IMF. There is no other solution. No one has proposed a viable solution. It's a requirement by the bondholders to enter into negotiations. It was a requirement of the French plan, as Mr. Duquesne can confirm. It is a requirement to get any additional aid. It's the only way to get any confidence back into the system. This is one. Two, we absolutely need the capital control law as soon as possible. We just cannot keep on going like this. I don't think people understand the damage that's being done without capital control. In addition to not having norms to transfer money overseas, most importantly, we need to protect the assets of banks overseas. These are not bank assets, these are the depositors' assets. So anybody who gets paid because they get a judgment overseas is getting paid out of the other depositors. It's like someone transferring money after October 19, except one is doing it legally, one has done it illegally, but the net result on the depositors is the same. Also, if we risk losing, having attachments on the correspondent bank account, that also affects the new money, the new cash, because the banks continue to be the same banks. So we need to have a capital control law. And for those who are worried that the last draft may have given immunity to the bankers, well, let's put in a provision that says nothing in this law gives immunity to anybody for past actions. So I think that's an easy point to address, but we need the capital control law. We need the proper bank restructuring, as Dr. Saidi and others have said. We cannot have each depositor sue independently and just go to court. This is why you have bankruptcy systems and insolvency systems. The laws that we have in Lebanon, the two laws dealing with bank restructurings and bankruptcy, unfortunately, too old and not quite adapted to the situation. We need to have a proper bank resolution framework. We need to have a proper process. It is completely chaotic, unacceptable from a legal perspective for each one to start attaching assets here and there. That's why you have bankruptcy rules. We need to stop the spending at the central bank of the mandatory reserves, including now for the artificial increase in the price in the Lebanese pound. It makes no sense. It makes no sense to be subsidizing the currency in the absence of a reform plan. And we, of course, need a proper reform plan by the government, and the government should share it and discuss it publicly with the stakeholders. There's not a lot of time to do all of this, but I still think we can get somewhere between now and May 15. Thank you.
Thank you. Before taking Mr. Sabra, do you really believe, Dr. Buslayman, that the parliament today, half of them are candidates for the upcoming elections? Do you believe that they are really ready and they have the will to sign any deal with all the requested reforms included in any deal with the IMF? Do you think they are ready to do this?
No, I don't think they're ready. That's not what I propose. I'm proposing that the government signs
at least a draft, at least the first
framework,
draft.
but it would be implemented by the next parliament. I agree with you. I think before the elections, there is no way for the current parliament to approve anything. However, once an agreement in principle is reached, it becomes politically costly for anybody coming in to say, you know what, I want to accept the agreement. So it becomes kind of a fait accompli, difficult to displace. That's why I would encourage strongly the current government to try to reach an agreement.
So let's start by the framework. Let's start by a clear draft, maybe to be signed by the government. Then the upcoming parliament will be voting on it. You moved your hand like you are agreeing with many points mentioned by our previous panelists. Mr. Saad Sabra.
Well, thank you so much. A lot has been said, and I completely agree with all the points that were made as far as the diagnostic and the analyses of what's happened in Lebanon, what led us here, what were the issues. I think it goes back to several decades that sort of compiled until it reached here. And the October of 2019 events that led to the closure of the banking sector, I would like to echo or reiterate on this as actually, I agree with Dr. Saidi that this was, I think, one important trigger that really led us to the situation today that's deteriorating. And I also agree with Mr. Hasbani that I know there is no rock bottom. It will continue to deteriorate as such. But the bottom, I think the idea is, for me, rather than looking backwards and analyzing the situation, because Lebanon, everyone knows that it has been through shocks and shocks and shocks, but then the one that we are living in today is very much multidimensional, complicated, and it's an accumulation of a lot of mistakes. Now, the way forward, I mean, to be quite honest, I also agree with Mr. Abu Sliman that the situation today can be looked at in that kind of mindset of what kind of triggers can the Lebanese do. Not necessarily a full-fledged implementation plan. It's a trigger that would establish that.
Can you answer this question?
Yes, the signing of the agreement with IMF is a trigger. It might not be. It might not be something.
This is the main one. This is the main one.
It's a nice positive trigger
Okay.
that could create that sort of signaling impact that Lebanon is going somewhere. Is it implementable? Is it doable now? There's so many impediments on the political front. But let me focus a bit on where Lebanon is heading as far as the mobilization of support, the mobilization of capital, and maybe focus a bit on the private sector. Because the reality is Lebanon is in crisis mode. There's a thin line between being in a crisis mode or a developmental mode. For the international community to be able to support Lebanon and the Lebanese people, it's very hard to work as part of that mindset, and because of that gloomy or very dim visibility. So as part of a crisis mode, there will be some piecemeal approaches here and there. We hear about emergency finances here, humanitarian support that takes place here and there. But it's limited, and it will never be able to meet the requirements. And you will see some social protection projects or financing health, education. But if you look at the broader baseline of the economy today, and I'm trying a bit to focus on the private sector. The private sector remains the engine of this economy. And
what is the future? Let me here ask you a question.
Right.
So I'll go directly to the questions, the Q&A, but this is a main point. What is the future of the private sector in Lebanon? How do you see it?
It's very gloomy, to be honest. It's not clear. The private sector is going through a severe drainage and sort of exit of capital. So there's a capital flight, a human capital flight, and the private sector is really struggling today. I mean, the informal economy, one can argue that there is still some sort of lifeline that remittances continue to flow to Lebanon. The private sector continues to transact, but it's all part of this informal setup where the lack of an authorizing environment, the stakeholder of the government making the necessary policies to allow the private sector to be that key contributor is not there. So in quite honesty, for the private sector to continue to operate in the country as needed, and giving the resilience of the private sector in Lebanon and the type of vibrant status, I mean, honestly, I think it's really going through a very negatively draining situation where such resilience might have an end, and a collapse of the state will have a direct impact on the private sector. Again, one can argue that from an access to basic services perspective, the private sector can continue to operate, but it will not be to the level that it's needed, and it will not be to the level that could actually create that growth.
Can you give me two scenarios? The good one and the bad one.
Well, a good scenario is what we call a political breakthrough, where there's a political shift in the country that would open up a new stage for policy making and for structural reforms that would impact the entire country, that will allow to restore some trust in the system. And such confidence, as again, by virtue of triggers here and there, could be restored. And we have cases with many crises that have happened in many places in the world where such triggers were made by the government that allowed that kind of restoration of trust that will trickle down to like that growth model and recovery model that is needed. A bad scenario is what we call a political gridlock, which means there's a vacuum in Lebanon, nothing is happening, a drainage on all resources, including reserves, that could lead to a complete collapse, and then Lebanon would be a similar economy to where, like to Somalia, for instance, where everything is informal and the private sector is just providing basic services based on such informal economy and cash-based economy.
Thank you. Mr. Dukan, you wanted Lebanon to sign a deal with the IMF before the upcoming elections. I don't know if we still have time, but also yesterday our Deputy Prime Minister, Mrs. Saad al-Shami, said that we are going in the right way to sign the deal with the IMF. Why an IMF agreement is urgent, is necessary for Lebanon to be signed ASAP? And is it possible to have a fair deal for Lebanon, taking into considerations all what is happening now in Lebanon?
No, the question is, of course, not innocent. There are still many people in the country, even in the reformist camp, if I may say so, still convinced that an IMF agreement is not absolutely necessary. And far too many thinking it is not possible. And I totally agree with Minister Buslayman that it is possible. And I would argue with Deputy Prime Minister Azbani that this is the international patronage that he is looking for. There is no other international patronage possible than the IMF at this stage. It is necessary for at least 4 reasons. One, it's the only way to regain confidence from all actors, certainly international, but also the Lebanese people. 2, it will in itself deliver assistance to the country, financial and technical. 3, it will give, and that was alluded to, a full-fledged framework for reforms, linking them together. And 4, and it might be the carrot, it will be a catalyst for other financing. The remobilization of some said funding, the said conference. I had the pleasure and the honor to organize it 4 years ago. And that was the only chance to avoid an IMF program at the time. Maybe it could be the first chance, conversely, to seize after the conclusion of an IMF program. Financing also at some stage more structural support, including, who knows, budgetary support from bilateral and multilateral. It is a key, and that was something that Mr. Sabra could have added. It is a key to foreign investment in Lebanon. And it also, when time will come, and access to international capital markets. So those are the main reasons why it's absolutely necessary. It is possible. It's no longer the situation of Spring 20, 2 years ago, where the authorities had various positions in front of fund staff. The diagnosis on the state of the financial system is the same, and the discussion on the remedies is advancing. It's what was said by the Vice Prime Minister yesterday. Yes, indeed, negotiations are underway. There will be next week fund mission in Beirut. And I am absolutely convinced that if there is a clear political will in the Lebanese side, it is possible to conclude before the election. Yes, indeed, as just said by Kamila Buslayman, because there are no technical difficulties. It's not complicated in IMF terms. And we France and the international community in general have the strong feeling that, yes, there is a window of opportunity now. Because if I may add to what was said, after the parliamentary election on May 15, we will have a caretaker government for the shortest time, I hope, then the presidential election, then an automatic resignation of the government, and a new caretaker government, and so on, with the question of majorities. So there is strictly no possibility of there is just an alternative between now and the end of the year. There is no in-between position. So is it probable? Highly probable, I would not dare to say so, but it's now. It's now or end of 22, and nobody in Lebanon can afford that. Humanitarian assistance will not be sufficient. And we have seen at the occasion of two humanitarian conferences I organized in December 20 and August 21, that some bilateral donors were on the verge to condition their humanitarian assistance to reforms. So you could say it's not normal, maybe it's not. But as said by Camille Abou-Sleiman, time has passed and the degree of confidence of the international community is very, very low. Whatever happened in Lebanon, it's no longer the center of their preoccupation. It was not before the Ukraine crisis, and it's no longer now. There is one country which continues to consider it's important. It's my country. Thank you.
Thank you. You have something to add?
Maurice?
Yes,
Sorry,
please. Of course, but I just wanted to take Mr. Hasbani for 1 minute, then I have a question also to ask you, Dr. Mr. Abou-Sleiman. So
Yeah, just
I'll
to
take
build,
Mr. Hasbani.
to build on what Mr. Duquesne was saying, yeah, absolutely. The patronage I was talking about was a political patronage, because I truly believe that we are beyond economic patronage. I don't believe this government will end up signing anything with the IMF, let's be realistic, because this government represents an existing parliament, and it represents political parties, the current government today. It has representation from the current parliament, so any action taken by this government will reflect on parliamentarians in the current parliament. So from a political perspective, realistically, it's very difficult.
Be like this in Lebanon.
And this is why we've never had solutions as drastic as we expect them to be, like the IMF program. For the same reasons, we had a problem with the implementation of CEDR, and we've had this conversation, Mr. Duquesne and I, quite a few times before CEDR and after CEDR, when we were all trying to push through the reforms as a precondition, and we did all we could, but there was a political hurdle, or many political hurdles ahead of those reforms. So I totally understand and respect and agree with all the solutions that are being put on the table. I agree that the IMF program is the only starting point for the solution, but the concerns that Mr. Duquesne has expressed, I totally share them as well. No, if there is no solution today with this current government, a caretaker government which could be for quite some time, and then presidential elections after that, so we won't be seeing any progress on the economic side until we have a full political solution post-presidential elections that should also be guaranteed.
And if we will have it, at what cost we will have it? So
Pardon?
at what cost we will have it?
Precisely. This would be a detrimental cost to Lebanon. The question is there anyone actually listening or understanding the gravity of the situation? Yeah. I would love to believe so. The reality requires, though, a bigger intervention, more on the political level than the economic level at this stage, and then drive to the economic level. This is why we're talking about renewing Lebanon's political and economic structures.
Yes. Mr. Abou-Sleiman, Your Excellency.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to, in addition to what Mr. Duquesne said, of course, I agree with all his points on the IMF. There are 4 additional points I would like to make. One, it's a requirement of the bondholders, so we cannot engage in restructuring of the bonds without going to the IMF. So that's an additional critical reason. 2,
can you elaborate more, please? Here, can you elaborate?
Yes, meaning that the bondholders, especially the foreign bondholders, will not engage in discussions with the government unless they know that whatever they agree to, let's say they agree to a 75% haircut, let's say, they need to know that there is debt sustainability at the end. I happen to have worked on the Ukraine and the city of Kiev restructuring. It was the same thing. Whatever the creditors wanted, you would tell them, listen, the IMF thinks that's the debt servicing capacity of the country or of the city. It's the same things. They need to know whatever agreement they do, they have to have confidence that it will be repaid. And therefore, they will not entertain any discussion without the IMF. This is one, in addition to all the other points. 2, As we know, there is a significant social component. Now it's a requirement of the IMF that a big portion of the money goes to social spending, which is absolutely critical given the situation in Lebanon. 3, I personally have zero confidence, that the government or the parliament will be able to implement the hard reforms that are required. If not, any new borrowing will be just throwing money down the drain. So we need the IMF contractual obligation on the government and parliament to do the reforms. Otherwise, we'll never get these reforms done. I mean, Ghassan, myself, and May were together in government, and we were talking about reforms all the time. They just will get away with doing nothing if they can. And the last thing, and the most important thing for me, is that we have prepaid the cost of the IMF. So what the Lebanese people have suffered through already, which is the devaluation and the inflation, this is harder than any cost that the IMF has ever imposed in its history. For instance, the Egypt program had 2 preconditions. One is lifting the subsidies, and the second one is floating the
and we were done yet. So we were already done.
So it's all done already in Lebanon. So what happened is that we've done everything, yet we have gotten none of the benefits.
But
so
you still have what
really
is related directly.
possible.
But you still have what is related directly to the public sector, and here's what we call
what I'm
the
saying
political
is that
red
the
lines.
price, everybody complains that the price is going to be. We already paid the price. We got nothing. We just paid. We suffered the pain, and we had none of the benefits.
What happened was multiple times times what any IMF program would have required from you. But I think we have to guard a little bit against optimism. Camille, you mentioned, and all of you were in government at the time, the IMF program was discussed and rejected. Let's be clear what an IMF program would comprise. You've got to change monetary policy. You've got to abandon the idea that you can continue with a fixed rate. You've got to unify exchange rates and move towards flexible rates. You've got to change monetary policy towards controlling inflation more than anything else. You've got to stop financing government. You've got to stop subsidies. That's on the monetary side. On the fiscal side, you've got to restructure public finances. You cannot continue with the size of government that you have. You've got to do something about the state-owned enterprises and government-related enterprises, starting with EDL, water, and all the rest. And then you've got to restructure the banking and financial system. You need, as you rightly pointed out a bit earlier, you need a bank resolution authority and therefore a bank resolution act. And that has to be independent. All that has to happen. At the same time, you need to ask yourself, can I really restructure public finances and still keep banking secrecy? Banking secrecy needs to go. We cannot continue with that illusion that we're going to build a new Lebanon out of that. So when you think of the multiple things that would be in an IMF program, the question is there a willingness within the Miati government to even start addressing these? They weren't even capable of having a reform budget. Look at the budget that's being presented to Parliament today. No reforms in there. You have multiple exchange rates in there. So this is not serious. Very true, as everybody is agreeing, that an agreement with the IMF is a confidence-building measure. It is a sine qua non for getting any international finance, of getting any international aid. Living in the Gulf as I do at the moment, I know that the GCC countries will not advance to help Lebanon if there is no IMF program in place, because that will impose discipline on policymakers. But we have to understand, of course, that any IMF program is also going to be a multi-year program. It's a 3 to 5 year program. And therefore, you're going to have to ask yourself, will they be able to put in place time-consistent policies, or will they try to change that? So I'm just guarding against unrealistic optimism of saying that we would achieve all that before the elections. I haven't seen any willingness in our politicians to actually do that. Yes, they could come out as saviors, but is there any courage at the level of the current government and the politicians behind that? I just don't see that. I think what we need to do is to say, this is the list of things that need to happen, and we can discuss that. But I don't think we should have any illusions that this could happen by May. I might be wrong. I'd love to be wrong, but I just don't see the reasons for optimism so far.
Thank you. I need to go back to Mr. Bustaiman because you have something to add before I ask you the question.
Yes, I would like. I'm not. By the way, I'm not optimistic. I think it's possible, Dr. Saidi. I hope it happens. But there are two things that can and should happen immediately, and frankly, I don't understand why they don't happen. One is capital control. There is not a single person in Lebanon that doesn't understand why we need it. Yet, for whatever reason, it doesn't happen. The excuse, as I said, the excuse that they used last time was that it grants bankers immunity. Great, remove the immunity, remove any reference to any judgment, just pass a simple capital control law. There is no excuse not to do that. Two, stop spending money in a non-transparent way, stop spending the mandatory reserves. This hysteria of trying to keep the Lebanese pound artificially high is an electioneering thing. It makes zero economic sense in the absence of a plan. I hope we all agree. So at least let's try to get these two things done so we can come up with something concrete and practical.
Yeah.
Sorry, Maurice.
Yes, please. I have a question related to the savings of the Lebanese. You mentioned, and we all agree that we need a restructuring of the banking sector, and this is one of the main reforms requested by the international community and also by all of us. So what is the future of the savings in Lebanon? Let's be clear with the people. Let's be clear with the depositors. What happened with this money? One day we will get this money, we'll get 10%, 20%. Mr. Abu Sulaiman, also I would like to hear also the point of view and the answer.
Yeah, you have all these eminent economists. You should be asking me this question.
Because
you know what? I'm happy to answer first and then let everybody give their opinion. There is one thing that is going on which I find also a little bit off the wall. The politicians are lying to the Lebanese people. They're just lying to them and telling them they're going to get their money back. They're not going to get their money back, or at least a big chunk of their money back. It's very simple. The banks have $105 billion approximately. I haven't seen the latest figures. That's the total commercial bank deposits denominated in US dollars. Against that, there is $85 billion at the central bank. Against that, so about 75% of the dollar assets of the commercial banks and therefore the depositors is held with the central bank. Against the 85 billion, we have in cash, we don't know exactly how much we have. Let's say we have 10 or 11 billion dollars. Plus we have the value of the gold. So we have $27 billion against a payable of 85 billion. Now, not all of the 85 billion, of course, is due today. But this is the gap we're talking about. This is the gap at the central bank without discussing other issues. So therefore, of course, you're not going to get all of your money back. However, there are
I would love to hear this, however. Many would love to hear this, however, Doctor.
I am going to tell you.
Go ahead, please.
I disagreed significantly and historically with the full bail-in that the Lazar plan, the Diab plan proposed. I don't think it's fair or reasonable to consider, given that the main problem is the central bank not paying back or not being able to pay back the commercial banks, that you put zero responsibility on the central bank. The state, as the shareholder of the central bank, has an obligation under the law to recapitalize the central bank. Therefore, there has to be a judicious use of state assets in favor of only in favor of small depositors, not in favor of big depositors or bank owners or politicians. And there are several things we can discuss on that. I am not in favor of full bail-in and zero use of state assets. Needs to be judicial. There's all sorts of ideas on that. I have papers on the subject. Other people have papers. We can discuss it in more detail. But what I thought the Lazar plan was very good at, which is for the first time, it basically recognized the reality, acknowledged the losses.
Before asking, yes, go ahead, Mr. Musaiman.
No, but very importantly, on the remedies, we need to have an open discussion, a proper discussion. There has to be some responsibility on the state to recapitalize the central bank and therefore help the depositors. So I think a solution is there. Also, what's happening now is that through the lirification that's happening, the depositors are paying the price. The depositors, any solution has to start with the shareholders who have lost their capital. We have to recognize they've lost all of their capital. Then the subordinated debt and the preferred shares and all of that. And at the very end, the depositors. But you can't have the depositors, each one trying to collect money on his own. That's why we need a proper structure and fair system. Thank you.
What is a proper restructuring of the banking sector?
Look, I think it's important to first realize that it's not one size fits all. There is all types of scenarios that could be adopted. What's needed today is that sort of framework to agreeing on what sort of plan needs to be applied. So the restructuring of the banking sector is not going to be done in one day. It could take years. In that, you bring upon, I mean, if I go back a little bit, one step back to where IMF is, if IMF agrees to that framework will include all these fundamental prerequisites that are going to have to be adopted by the government, or else there is no rescue. And these fundamental prerequisites include the monetary policy, the fiscal policy, etc., and the type of fiscal reforms that are needed. When it comes to restructuring the banking sector, the reality is that the most important stakeholder, which is the depositor, they're already taken the haircut. The haircut has already been applied de facto. And as you do this restructuring plan, the more you are able to establish trust as far as the way forward, and the more you are able to establish the political authorizing environment around such rescue plan, the more you are able to attract capital into the sector. So in some cases, the restructuring of the banking sector could be as optimistic as including a recapitalization plan of the banking sector, which can involve private capital, or it could be as simplistic as a complete bail-in and losses that are enduring over a number of years. Again, depending on what is agreed with the IMF, depending on what scenario they take, I strongly believe, and call me optimistic, that we live in a world where you can signal out these type of initiatives. I don't know. I know IMF is stating that there is progress. Now, one can define progress in many ways, but there might be a way for IMF might end up agreeing with this government that an agreement is not doable, but maybe a memorandum of understanding is doable. So these are, to IMF, steps as part of that are taken as part of a long journey. This journey will only be successful if an authorizing environment is in place. Today, the private capital mobilization notion is not doable. There is a huge sense of fatigue and frustration by the developmental financial institutions community to do anything in Lebanon unless there is these type of steps and signals that show that there is that kind of will that has been so much lagging for many years.
Mr. Dukan, we have the diagnostic of the crisis. We all know the protocol of how to solve this crisis, but we still need the will. What should we do to push the stakeholders in Lebanon to save this country? And how to ensure some economy recovery in Lebanon? As someone, I know it's been like a year and a half or 2 years, you know a lot of what is happening in the backgrounds and what is happening in the coulisses of the Lebanese with the Lebanese authorities. So what should be done also to push the stakeholders now to move and to save this country?
I think what we can try to do is to take the matters a bit differently. So I will not enter in the debate on financial losses and so on, because I said it is not the essential. And I will suggest that during an electoral campaign, and this is where Lebanon is as friends, everybody would address not only the government, but also other people, usual topics that you would imagine to be on the agenda. And let me quote 4 of them. It might surprise you that I would do so, but I think it's a way to think out of the box and not just to add figures. The first one is climate change and renewable energies. In the 70s, 70% of electricity was produced by dams, and now the country is importing 97% of energy, as said, under the form of fossil fuels, when we all know that Lebanon is rich of local resources, water, sun, wind, and so on. And when people speak about energy, they rightly say regulation of the sector, reform of ADL, reducing the role of private generators, and so on. But they do not say, strange enough, increasing the share of renewables under a national plan. I know there are local initiatives, but they are not included in the national vision. And you are referring to what I may know from the coulisses. I'm not Lebanese, I'm French. But in the energy plan that was recently approved, there are 5 objectives. And none of that 5 is increasing the part of renewables. And at the end of the period, 2030, maybe a stock of 10% of energy production would be under renewable forms. So why not addressing that? The role of the public sector and the state is another topic, which is not on the table. Governance, poor governance, corruption is on the table. And I note that because of that, there is a feeling in the Lebanese population that state is not a good thing, and the same feeling did exist in Eastern Europe before the 90s or in the beginning of the 90s. Conversely, the international community does not trust public finance circuits and is now channeling its humanitarian assistance directly to the population through NGOs and international organizations. But I think a debate could exist at least on 2 matters. What should be the role of the state in various sectors? Health and education come first, but also transport, energy and water. So in some, the basic needs. This is not in the public debate from anybody. And second, and this is a risk, as the risk of being a failed state, how to avoid that Lebanon would become a new republic of the NGOs. A third matter, which is not in the public debate, and once again, not only from the political class, but from the rest, poverty and inequalities. Lebanon has never been characterized by equality. In a recent normal year, let's say 2014, the top 10% of the population was earning more than 50% of the national income. And of course, inequalities are increased by the crisis as such, but also by the means to deal with it. And I would argue that lyrification of the banking accounts on the one hand, and conversely, dollarization of the cash payments are factors which increase inequality. So they are no longer a question of monetary policy, they are a factor of inequality. So there must be a reflection now, and Camille Bousselman reference to that, to social protection, social inclusion. And it can be done within an IMF program. My 4 point to put on the debate new topics is tax policies. The state revenues to GDP ratio in Lebanon is one of the lowest in the world, to be compared to Zimbabwe, 6% of GDP. A not well-managed sub-Saharan African country is at 15%. And the average in the OECD countries is around 1/3. And I can understand the argument, let's not speak about taxes without knowing what would be the services given by a state. But conversely, there won't be any delivery of public services without taxes. So debates should be on the table, even if you do not believe at all in an IMF program, on the nature of taxes, direct or indirect. If indirect, what level of VAT? What kind of consumption incentives through VAT? If direct, incomes or capital? on corporation or households, and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying here is that even if you, like some of our friends today, do not believe at all in an IMF program soon, put on the table the real matters, And I was struck that I was referred to by the fact that the debate on the 2022 budget was on the dollar exchange rate applied to customs, and not on the various hikes of taxes here and there. There was things to be said, even in the small choices in the 22 budget. But the debate was legal more than substantive. Once again, those are just, for example, to say, let's think out of the box, not refer permanently to the financial sector. It's well beyond that. And that could help, who knows, even if you don't believe in an IMF program, to advance. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hasbani, what should the international community watch out when attempting to assist a country like Lebanon?
The lies of the Lebanese political class, to start with. And I think we've been through this many times in the past, and Monsieur Duquesne has seen it firsthand several times, I guess. I think, look, it's very important to understand that this conversation we're having now would have been extremely useful and impactful had it been like 2, maybe 3 years ago, where it was more timely. Right now, I believe we've headed beyond this kind of type of recovery discussion. And we need to understand also that the international community has always been misled by people in power in Lebanon to believe that there is always a hope in taking action. As I said, starting even going back as far as Paris 1, 2, and 3, all the way to CEDR, and now talking about an IMF recovery program. All the ideas are great. We have laws in place. We have the electricity law, telecoms law, all other kind of very nice reform ideas. More recently, we had the public procurement law. Extremely good titles. Extremely good excuses for drawing the international community's attention with legislation. Yet, we could even have a capital control law, if you like, with an empty content or a damaging content. And laws that are thrown left, right, and center without having a complete program to pass them all together as one package. Because you can't have basically a capital control law and wait for 5 years before you have any reforms in the government or any hope of getting a resolution on the restructuring of banks, for example. Talking about the public assets, yes, of course, we've put this idea of utilizing public assets more than 3 years ago, 2.5 years ago. We put it forward. It made it partially to the government plan, to the Diab government plan, but it was camouflaged in various forms and shapes. So basically, there's always a good title for legislation. There's always a good promise for reforms. There are visits, and in these visits, a lot of promises are put on the table, yet nothing is actually achieved. The key issue here is, as was rightly said earlier, most of what an IMF program would ask for has been by default achieved, quite a lot of it, except for the parts that require reforms in the public sector, which remove the power from the political class. For example, a simple thing like a properly appointed regulatory authority for electricity or telecoms, a asset utilization in terms of putting a privatization program when the value of these assets is at the right level. So we have more than 70 laws that are unimplemented, but the core 4 or 5 ones that make the difference are the most important ones to look at. Yet one promise after the other, one hope after the other, and we're plunging further and further into a failed state scenario. We may call it failed state, we may call it to fail or about to fail, but in reality, public services are have completely disappeared. The private sector is taking initiatives here and there with whatever is left in the informal economy. We're moving completely to an informal economy gradually. The banking sector is almost barely surviving the political class trying to squeeze the last bit of reserves that exist in the central bank with no solutions. We have a judiciary system that is being used as a tool by the ruling elites who are basically trying to force every single opposition or reform attempt out of the equation completely. Totally destructive as far as what's left of the banking sector is concerned. And we're facing a situation where the international community are still hoping that someone or somewhere these ideas will resonate and somebody will bounce back a good action. This cannot happen now. I think we're beyond this. What we need to start focusing on very quickly is how can the international community avoid these pitfalls now and start talking about more a political solution and a patronage for a discussion towards a political solution before the situation gets from a failed state to a rogue failed state, which is detrimental to its neighborhood.
I would love to hear also the point of view of the international institution as an IFC. What should you watch out when assisting a country like Lebanon?
Look, so I think what Mr. Hasbani said is correct. There is already that huge sense of fatigue and so many attempts that have been made by the international community in the past were not met. I will not specify them, but there were so many intervals, if you say, of international community being misled here and there. But the reality is that the international community will not let go. We will continue to keep trying. I mean, this is just the way we are operating. You know, we're machines that were established to continue to engage for certain mandates, for certain reasons that as long as Lebanon as a sovereignty is existing, we will continue to try. But again, what is that political breakthrough that is needed? It's based on Lebanon's risk and resilience, if you will. We continue to monitor that and see that at one point there has to be that kind of authorizing environment or change that will allow us to actually intervene in that notion. From an IFC point of view, the private sector is there. It will never go anywhere. But how do we go about establishing that strategic approach? We're not able to do it today. Today, everything we do is very, very opportunistic, where we can actually engage with the private sector in Lebanon, that if not in Lebanon, we're happy to work with them to take them to new markets. And so the only thing that we can do right now is what we call invest out of Lebanon rather than invest in Lebanon. But we want to be able to do more. And for that to happen, again, that political shift is needed, I believe.
Dr. Saidi, you've described the way Lebanon has been raising money in recent decades as a Ponzi scheme. I want you to elaborate more what you mean here. And the main question is, do you think at the end the banking sector will survive in Lebanon?
I want to go back a little bit to the discussion we just had about the private sector. If you want the private sector really to play its role, then it's going to need the banking and financial sector to finance it. And it's going to also need external financing. I'd like to mention a plan which I talked about just yesterday, and it's in 3 parts. The first part, where you talk about restructuring the banking system, and we said it needs a banking resolution authority. What that means is that you're going to have to look at mergers and acquisitions and liquidation of some of the banks. Maybe 50% of the banks are going to disappear. But the main point, as we discussed a bit earlier, is you need a recapitalization. The shareholders of the banks need to understand that they have lost their capital. What we're talking about are zombie banks. So you're going to need about 20 billion to come into the banking system. Recapitalization by the shareholders and the bankers themselves. Of course, you can have part of that being a bail-in. Then you would then say to the depositors, not a haircut, but let them become shareholders in the banks once they have been cleaned out. I think that's one element of a restructuring plan. The second element of a restructuring plan addresses the big gap that we were talking about at the central bank. I want to propose a radical
numbers before you continue and you proceed.
Yeah.
Do you agree on the latest numbers?
Yes, I think the losses are in excess of 70 billion, probably around 75 billion, something like that, but increasing over time.
Yes.
So therefore, there is no possibility of recovering any deposits. You have to look at what are the assets that we're talking about. There's some foreign exchange held by the central bank, maybe 10 billion, 9 billion, or I don't know, 11 billion, plus the gold, right? So we're talking about 27, 28. Then you've got the assets of the state, right? State-owned enterprises, government-related enterprises, and land, okay? Plus any other future rights that the government has because of monopolies that it has. Those are the basic assets that you're talking about, plus assets owned by the banks. So any restructuring has to look at all three. So if we start off with the banks, we mentioned restructuring the banking sector. The second one, I think, is then you need to restructure the central bank. My radical proposal is that we should change the Banque du Liban into something like the Swiss National Bank. The Swiss National Bank is a company established by shares under a monetary act, but then it is owned also by the public, in part by government, but also by the public, and it's a listed entity. So what we would do then is we transform it into a joint stock company. Monetary policy would still be run independently, but then depositors can become shareholders in the banks, in the central bank, along with the banks. So if you have a new central bank, very much like the Swiss central bank, I think we were beginning to go towards a solution. The third part is to create a national wealth fund where we would have the state-owned enterprises, land and government-related enterprises, part of a national wealth fund which is independently managed. You would improve the governments, remove the politicians and their capture of much of the state-owned assets, from telecom to water to electricity and to all the rest. Have it managed efficiently and independently as it should be run, like Temasek in Singapore. Temasek in Singapore yields about 15% on average to government. So if you put all that and you start running it efficiently, then we could start earning some revenue in the future. And then I would have depositors also part of the national wealth. So instead of having the large losses that you now have, depositors would become shareholders in banks, shareholders in the central bank, and shareholders in the National Wealth Fund. And if you have a properly structured and governed wealth fund, then you could attract a lot of private capital into public-private partnerships, and then you could hope, if you've restructured your banking sector, to start financing the private sector. I think those are three building blocks that, if you want to really solve Lebanon's problems, you should be thinking of.
Mr. Hasbani, you agree? I'll take you, Mr. Sabr. Mr. Hasbani, you agree on what Mr. Saidi just said concerning also the restructuring and to start from somewhere the way of solving the problem?
Technically, in principle, yes, and part of the solutions that he's proposing, I proposed again 2.5 years ago.
Yeah.
And we were hoping, at the time when there was a hope in putting an IMF program together with the previous government, that kind of solutions would be incorporated there, because again, yes, practically and technically speaking, to get the deposits back or the value of deposits back, you need to utilize whatever assets are available out there. And this independent management of public assets. And just between brackets, a lot of people dismiss this idea because of stating two reasons. One is that these are kind of the ownership of the public, and it's kind of public. Yet the very idea of owning shares by the public and depositors answers that issue. At the same time, it is debt that has been placed as a burden on that public that owns these assets would be relieved by having them put there, independently managed professionally. Second issue is that people state that there's no value in these assets anymore. Of course, if you take now the nominal value of these assets today, you wouldn't find much in them. But if they have been managed properly and there's a recovery plan being put in place with reforms in the public sector,
The value will change.
the value and the future value increases, therefore the share value would increase. So again, this kind of incentive for depositors with caveats on who do you consider to be particularly the small depositors who own shares in these assets. The value of these shares increases with time and then they can get them out. Let's not forget, the government still has quite a lot of assets, including gas and energy assets, which have a huge value on top of all the productive assets like ports, telecoms, etc. So I agree with this approach, but I reiterate another, the point that all of these solutions have to come together. You cannot have one without all the others. And that's why you need a full package.
You can't pick one alone
you can't.
and just go implement it.
Precisely.
It's a full plan, it's a full program.
Precisely.
Yes.
And it has to coincide again with a political patronage, a political solution. Otherwise, none of this would gather enough confidence to build value.
Yeah.
I
You
think
had something to add.
Yes, just a quick. It's exactly what Mr. Hasmani said. A solution has to be comprehensive. There is no way around taking one side and neglecting the other. What's important is as you do this, and in the case this doesn't happen, what happens? The piecemeal approach, as I mentioned earlier, is actually dominating. And just to the point that Mr. Saidi mentioned, in the absence of banks, do we still have room to work with the private sector today in the absence of bank and in the absence of a comprehensive solution? The reality is that there's other things that are, other segments of the financial markets that are evolving. Non-banking financial institutions are evolving, private equity funds are evolving, special debt funds are evolving, and to a certain level, financial institutions that are not necessarily deposit receivers are evolving, and they're establishing that kind of ad hoc services to the sector. This is where we think that in this very, very, very fluid, very uncertain scenario, the private sector still needs that sort of ad hoc help. In this case, what needs to happen is how do you go about de-risking Lebanon? Because Lebanon's risk is completely skyrocketing, and Lebanon's spread is at a point where it becomes impossible to mobilize any investment or funds for Lebanon. So cost of investment is extremely high. The room there is in this very pessimistic scenario of nothing happening. The reality is that the private sector is moving somewhere, and how do you go about providing that support outside of the banking sector? But I do agree that the banking sector is key and important, and it used to be an economic powerhouse, but it's not existing anymore.
I would like to hear more about what is related to the highest rate of financial exclusion now in Lebanon.
Yeah.
We worked a lot and for years to push people to go and work directly with the banking sector. Today, the banking sector is working as an exchange office maybe, but
you have a cash economy.
Exactly.
You have a cash economy.
So that's why I'm saying, Doctor, that we have a high risk of what is coming after the financial exclusion phase we are facing now.
I think just to come back to the point that was being mentioned, that Saad was raising, if I ask the IFC, would you take equity in private industry or in a business in Lebanon right now? The answer would be the return would have to be extraordinarily high because the risks are so high. So they would not come in. You still need your banking sector to be there to act as an intermediary. You cannot have total disintermediation of the banking financial sector and hope to have an efficient private sector, particularly if the private sector has to deal with the rest of the world. So we have to restructure that banking sector. It has to play an important element of any revival of the private sector. What can't happen, and is happening right now, is our private sector is leaving Lebanon along with our human capital. And the danger I see in that, and I've seen it in other countries that lose their human capital. Look at Salvador, look at Nicaragua, look at Cambodia, where you've had wars and problems. And where the human capital goes, it's very difficult to rebuild. And I think the biggest danger is that the loss of human capital means there's not much left inside the country, and that it'll be very difficult to rebuild the country. That, I think, is the biggest danger of all. So what we need to think of is to come back a little bit more seriously and say, what can we do about the educational sector, the health sector, the four sectors that are Lebanon's pillars, trade and tourism, banking and financial, education and health. We've got to try to think about how we rebuild them gradually. But it's not going to happen overnight, even if we have an IMF program.
How dangerous is to work? Yeah, but also I would love to ask this question: how dangerous is to work in a cash economy?
Very
And
dangerous.
what is related to it's going against all the international regulations. So it's dangerous.
It's look. Let me just in reflection to the point that Dr. Saidi mentioned, and it's the answer to that question is absolutely not. There's no way for any institutional investor to actually take any risk on Lebanon's balance sheet. But the reality today, is that a lot of companies in Lebanon's real sector, this is outside of the banking sector, and it's particularly in certain aspects where Lebanon continues to play some or provide some competitive edge, disruptive technology, agribusiness, a few things here that the companies are deciding to move their jurisdiction or balance sheets to another market, yet they operate out of Lebanon. And in some cases, if the Lebanon risk is completely nullified, then there might be some interest. And you would see that kind of trend take place, but not necessarily as strategic as you want to be. It's really, really selective. But no, the reality is Lebanon's banking sector has to be restructured. The picture has to be full as far as the way forward. And today, Lebanon, from a foreign direct investment perspective, is a no-go zone. This is the reality.
Mr. Dukan, what would you do at this stage to prevent the worst from happening?
Good question. First, action. No procrastination, action, even small ones. And the decisions taken by the government in the recent months, after months of inaction, since there was strictly no action, except two important decisions, the sovereign default decision in March 20 and the request for an IMF program in April. But for the rest, nothing. There are small things now, small, but going in the right direction, the removal of subsidies, the negotiation with the fund, the delivery of assistance to SMEs. We were speaking about private sector, SMEs having suffered from the port explosion. It's called the Lebanese Financing Facility. It's a trust fund managed by the World Bank. Or from the World Bank also, an assistance to the poorest, which is called Emergency Social Safety Net, which is the first big loan, which is not channeled through the classical means. And this is why it has been such a fight against last year to get that. I would also quote the conclusion of the tendering bid for the container terminal in the port. I do not dismiss the work on public procurement, and I do not dismiss the anti-corruption strategy. So that's action, small, I do repeat, but at least action. That is not reform. But even those signals were not given during the years 18, 19, and 20 to a certain extent. So, of course, that must be my second, to avoid the worst, completed by real reforms that we all know. Forgive me to be a bit stubborn through an IMF program, but just to insist here, that was said in passing by someone, that it's not a program that forces you to do everything at once. What is requested by the government is what is called an extended financing facility, which is a 3 to 4 years program, and every 6 months, staff, IMF staff, management, the international community, the board of the fund, would review the reforms implemented and disbursed in relation with the level of reforms. So no risk that money would be disbursed if no reform. That should trigger a virtuous circle. My third word on what could be done after an IMF program is SEDO. SEDO is well known through the two pillars, financing and reforms. There is the third one, which is investment. And the country desperately needs private and public investment. We have big and small investment. They are absolutely necessary, and they will have an important growth effect that will offset the adjustment effect of an IMF plan. Forgive me once again to say, in any case, with such a recession, the economy can only run within an IMF program. I would argue, finally, that you need a vision. And I'm not convinced by today's discussion that we are going to that vision. We are still enshrined in what was done in the past, not done, who is responsible of what, and so on. We need a vision from the political elite, from the economic elite. I don't know what the economic elite has as a vision for Lebanon. Not from abroad. This vision should be one of sustainable development, not just of management crisis or trying to say this is not my fault, but his fault, and so on. What is the vision for Lebanon? Only Lebanese can do that, and they must do that. And if they do not, and then we come to a point that was made, immigration will continue, and the country will lose its human capital. So there is a need for every stakeholder to say the model on which was based kind of prosperity, false prosperity, is now just broken. What do we do? Not whose fault is it? It's too late. It's the fault of everybody, I would say. But what do we do? So what is the kind of production that can be done in Lebanon? Should be the role of Lebanon as a financial center, not as said by some a Ponzi center, and so on. So many questions. Renewables. The big debates are not in the debate. And I do regret that. And I do repeat, with a fund program or without a fund program, that must be debated. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Abu Sulaiman, I guess you agree on many points mentioned by Mr. Dukan. What can you add? And on this stage, what should we do to prevent the worst happening?
Look, I think we need to focus on time. One, we're not going to resolve all of the political problems in Lebanon. This is way beyond our anybody's ability, really. We need to try to draw a line between the politics and the financial rescue. And we need to have a minimum consensus on the financial rescue. One. Two, we need to have proper, credible people running the process. You cannot have the people who got us there basically in charge of getting out of the process. Three, we cannot really talk seriously about a revival of the private sector, which has, by the way, started without a proper banking system. It's not just for the banks. We cannot have 10 years of zombie banks going on. We need to draw a line over the past, try to be as fair as possible with the depositors, but move forward with a shrunken number of banks. In order to do that, we need to resolve the receivable, the payable from the central bank to the banks, which is at the core. So we don't really have here a bank failure, meaning one particular bank mismanaged its loan portfolio. It's the whole system that has collapsed. There isn't a single bank that has not lost all of its capital. Therefore, we need a global solution, and we cannot really do anything with the private sector without the private sector being able to borrow and the people being able to put their money in the bank without risking attachment or bankruptcy or new regulations. And I insist again, we need to start with capital control and having some kind of moratorium and visibility over the spending of the mandatory reserves. After the central bank declared they will not touch them, well, they're going through them right now for, in my view, dubious reasons, which is sustaining the currency.
Yes, I guess we're getting close to the end of our time. I will ask each one of our panelists to give some recommendations in 1 minute. So the recommendations will be added to the final report that the Maishidia Institute will be preparing in the upcoming days. So I will start with you, Mr. Sama.
Well, I think the key word is actions. If I were to say that there's one thing that needs to be done in Lebanon. There are so many scenarios that can be adopted. What's been really the issue is implementation. And so action. I think if that takes place, I think the country could see a lot of good things. But it's really mind-boggling to see the different types of scenarios that are being discussed, solutions that are being contemplated. But I think the chronic issue that Lebanon is facing is lack of actions at all levels. And that change is required. I'll stop here.
Mr. Hasbani.
No, I totally agree. I think what we need is to put all these solutions in place. The IMF program is a must. The urgency of action is a must as well. All the solutions that we talked about can be part of a package, plus or minus, depending on how they are designed together. Action requires political will. Also, it requires knowledge and capabilities in those who are in charge of the executive branch and the legislative branch. In order to do this, a prerequisite for all that we have spoken about has to be a political change, because all of the above, all of these solutions cannot be put in place by people who don't even know how to put them in place, or have no will to put them in place, or no intention to put them in place.
They don't know how to put it in place, or they don't have the will to put it in place?
Neither intent, nor will, nor know-how.
Oh. Mr. Saidi, Dr. Saidi, your recommendations, please.
Look, I fully agree on the need for political change, but I call it actually transformation is required, not just reform or change. You need a change in the narrative. If I look at what's being discussed right now prior to elections, it is still the same themes. It is about sectarianism and communitarian politics and small politics. What is incredible in the political discussion and the narrative is that nobody's talking about the economic, financial, humanitarian, social dimension of matters. It is as though it was happening in some other country. Nobody seems to accept responsibility. So I think number one that needs to happen is we need to change the narrative. And I think the media has an important role to play. The international community has an important role to play. And there, I think if the politicians are unwilling to change, then I think we need more radical action. I'm in favor of imposing or threatening to impose personal sanctions on the main politicians. I think that is being discussed, including by our French friends, but not implemented. So personal sanctions is a language they understand. Freezing their assets is a language they understand. And I think we need to start talking about the stolen asset recovery program so that they feel that they're going to be affected. And if all of that doesn't happen, then I think it doesn't move them to action, then I think we need to start thinking even more radically into potentially coming to the United Nations and talking about a Chapter 7 intervention by the international community. That could be possible. So number one is trying to change the narrative. Number two, is try to get some confidence building measures. It could be the beginning of an agreement with the IMF, but we should have no illusion that it cannot be quick. It's going to take years for us to recover.
Thank you. Mr. Ducan?
Yeah, nearly 4 years after the conference CEDAW, you will forgive me to use again the 5 letters of CEDAW, and having in mind that was not Paris 4, indeed. So the international community did not bail out the absence of reform. The C was for conference. Today it means dialogue. The dialogue between all the Lebanese, between the executive and the legislative branches, between the Lebanese people and the authorities, with the international community. And even the best decision cannot be taken behind closed doors, and rules better than discretion in all of that, including, of course, that was said eloquently, on monetary policy. Economic, it's not, forgive me to repeat that, a financial crisis only. If there is only financial reasoning, the crisis will become more and more humanitarian, and there must be, and that was just said by Mr. Saidi, a broad socio-economic vision time has come of real economy. 3 was development, pour le développement. In the midst of a crisis, you need to think long-term. Short-term decisions should not be impediment to long-term prospect. And this is also a word for those not believing that IMF program is possible. I do repeat, what can be done on the long term. Par les réformes, they are here for years. The only difference now is that they should be in the framework of an IMF program. And I think it's a plus and not a minus for the reforms. And finally, it was avec les entreprises, and the richness of this country, yes, indeed, is in its business sector. It's time to produce in Lebanon in a renewed business climate. So no need to repeat, that will be my final word, that France stands ready to help Lebanon and the Lebanese people, and to mobilize the international community, including on smaller things, which I'm doing now with country from the Gulf. And we will not forget this country, Lebanon, in its very delicate situation and in this delicate period. But the main responsibility rests on the Lebanese themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ducan. Mr. Abu Sulaiman?
Okay, thank you, Maurice. First, I would like to thank Mr. Ducan and France for their continued, sustained interest with Lebanon. We, unfortunately, are a very difficult place, unreliable, but please don't give up hope for Lebanon. This is one. 2, as I said, capital control immediately, not containing any immunity for anyone who has transferred money or done anything wrong, but capital control, not disguised capital distribution, proper capital control for the reasons we cited. 2, IMF program immediately. Even you have to make it costly for the politicians to basically block the program or not vote for it. It becomes, you can then question them. Underlying the IMF program, number 1, is because I have zero trust that the reforms will otherwise occur if they're not contractually imposed. We would need to reform the public sector to achieve that sustainability. We need to have a proper credible exchange rate policy. We need to have to pass a few laws, lift the bank secrecy or amend it, which is what the IMF is asking for anyway, and basically start implementing the public procurement law and the high authority for the fighting of corruption. And of course, bank resolution, for all the reasons we said. We cannot really restart the economy without a functioning banking sector, which will require dealing with the central bank payables to the banks, and some kind of immediate steps to stop spending the mandatory reserve. Right now, it's happening in a non-transparent way. Nobody knows what's happening. This has to stop. I don't think we should be waiting for a global political solution or a change. Of course, change is welcome, and first one who wants it. I just don't think that we should wait for Godot, really. We need to get going on the economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abu Sulaiman. We're getting close to the end of this panel. Mr. Saad Sabra, thank you. Mr. Ghassan Hasbani, Dr. Saidi, Nasser Saidi, Mr. Pierre Ducan, and also Mr. Camille Bouslayman. Thank you so much for your time. Well, we want to thank the Maishija Foundation, Media Institute, and the Public Affairs section at the U.S. Embassy in Beirut for organizing this project. Don't forget to follow the MCF Institute on all social media. Goodbye.